Mid-1800s, there was a story that started to show up in literature. It's a story that's lasted, you know, in various forms for the last 200 some years. And now historians will tell you, they'll tell you, this story actually existed long before it ever occurred in print for the first time. And we know a very kind of tame version of the story today. The original story, there's kids in the room, so I can't go into a ton of detail. But I do want to tell you the story. There was a mother pig who had 3 little pigs. And Mother Pig said, "Hey, boys, it's time to get out of here. Go make a way for yourself." And so the 3 little pigs, they went on out. And each one of them, they separated and they kind of got into their place and got their little piece of land. They were going to make a life for themselves. Well, the first little pig, he was a little lazy, he just didn't want to put a ton of effort in. So he started making himself a house. Anybody know what he built it out of? Yeah, hay, straw, we'll go with that. So he built this house out of hay. Second little pig, a little more ambitious, he built his house out of sticks. The third little pig, boy, he's a go-getter. So he built this house out of bricks, right? Stone. Well, the big bad wolf, he comes prowling around. And he's like, "Boy, I smell pig." Nah, that's probably what he said. He probably said, "I smell bacon." And so he comes around the corner. He's like, "Man, this pig done built him a straw house." And so he comes around there to the corner of the straw house, and he says, knocks on the door, and of course, the little pig looks through the little straw peephole. I don't know how you do a straw peephole, but you get one. And he sees him. He's like, "Well, I ain't coming out. Not by the hairs of my chinny chin chin." He's like, "All right, I'll see how it goes." So he goes through and he says, "I'm going to huff and I'm going to puff and I'm going to blow this house down." Sure enough, he does. Now, in the original version, pig number 1 doesn't get the pig house number 2. Okay? But in our nursery rhyme, okay, he goes and hangs out with his brother. And so he's in house number 2, the stick house. And sure enough, the wolf goes through the same thing, comes over there, knocks on the door. I look through it, see the peephole, it's a wolf. "Oh, you come on out. "Oh, not by the hair of my..." And I'm going to huff and I'm going to puff, I'm going to blow this house down. And so there it goes, and boom, here it comes again. First version, second brother doesn't make it either. But in our version, he gets to the third house, and there's a brick house, and sure enough, he's coming knocking on the door, look through the peephole, like, "Hey, I ain't coming out, and believe me, you ain't getting in here, And so he huffs and he puffs and he tries to blow his house down. It just ain't going nowhere. He huffs and puffs and blows it, and they ain't going nowhere, right? So in the original version, he decides, hey, there's a chimney. And so the wolf goes up into the chimney. And the pigs understand this. And so they start a fire. And they put this pot in the fire. And then the wolf comes down and gets in a pot of fire, and they put the lid on it. And then they have wolf for dinner. Right? Now, I think it's a good story. I think it's solid. I think it might teach us something about being entrepreneurial, about trying to put some hard work in, about making a life for ourselves. But I'll tell you, when I look into the Bible, I see a different message. And what I see is that eventually, if you live your life like the 3 little pigs, even if you are the brother that spends the time and builds the brick house, it means nothing. Because it's not what you build it with, it's what you build it on. That's what we find in the Bible. It's not what you build it with. It's what you build it on. There's a story in the book of Matthew. Matthew's the very first book in the New Testament. The Bible's broken up into two parts. An Old Testament, which talks about what happens before Jesus arrives. The New Testament, which talks about what happens after Jesus arrives. In particular, the book of Matthew. The very first one you'll come to in the New Testament. He has a story where he records a message that Jesus himself gives. We know it today as the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus sat on a mountainside and he gave this message. Well, inside of that, we want to take a look at a few passages. One this Sunday. One in particular, and it's at the end of the message. And I want to start at the end. We see in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, the very first word is therefore. And therefore denotes conclusion, right? It lets us know that there's something that happened before this. And because of what happened before this, we have a therefore. As a result of. Since we understand these things, then let these things be true. And so we want to start at the end. It's going to be a 3-week series. It's called Life on the Rocks. We want to start at the conclusion. I'm going to read it to you. It's pretty short, so stay with me. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 says this, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, this is Jesus talking. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fail, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. You see, after reading that passage, after hearing, if you're in the audience and you've heard Jesus' message, I don't know how long he talked for, but let's say he talked for 27 minutes, which is my target today, right? Let's say he talked for 27 minutes, and in his conclusion, those last 3 minutes, he pulls out that little gem there and says, hey, therefore, because of the first 24 minutes of my talk, therefore, here it is. Here's how it's going to work. Everything you've heard me say, for those of you who will put them into practice, like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And if you don't, if you ignore the first 24 minutes, like someone building his house on the sand. Ultimately, there's really just two options. It's just a metaphor. The rock, here it is. The rock is hearing that leads to action that results in change, right? The rock is hearing that leads to action that results in change. That's what Jesus is saying. I've said a bunch, therefore, the rock is hearing that leads to action that results in change. The other option is this, the sand. The sand is hearing and being content, remaining the same. The sand is hearing and being content, remaining the same. Jesus gives him their talk, gives him this message, this Sermon on the Mount, and he leaves them with two options. Either put it into practice or be content where you are. That is our choice today. We get to make that very same choice. Do we put into practice the words of Jesus that will result in change in our lives? Or do we just continue to be content? Ignore the words of Jesus, and we will remain the same. However, unfortunately, even though we have the opportunity to choose, there is still another part of the story to come, right? Because regardless of what happens, we each have built a house. And you might say, well, this is pretty heavy to drop on an audience for the first time. Jesus has this message, and he says, hey, here's the deal. I'm the Son of God, right? Ish, right? Maybe they get it. They probably don't. By the way, you need to do everything I say. And if not, right, house is going to fall down. It's going to be a disaster, But what we see in the Bible is that this message of understanding who God is and how you structure your life, this is not the same. In the book of Ezekiel, which is a book in that Old Testament prior to Jesus getting there, in chapter 13, Ezekiel actually is saying, hey, here's the deal. You want to build your life, and what you want to do is you don't want to take time to put the effort in to build it correctly. What you want to do is you want to get a bucket of white paint, You Googled hey, what's at Magnolia Lane that's white, right? What's her name? What's the girl's name? Joanna, that's right. You texted Joanna and said, hey, what's the new fashion white to put in my house? Right? And Joanna texts you back. It's uber white. And you're like, okay, great. So you went to Sherwin-Williams and you got uber white. And you came back and you painted uber white all over your house that you didn't spend any time or any effort in actually making it. And it looks nice. But long before Jesus ever showed up, Ezekiel's telling the people of God, hey, if that's how you build your life, where you just whitewash it, where you just make it look like everything is good, you make it pretty, eventually storms will come and the paint doesn't protect you. It doesn't allow it to stand. Then it's just a pretty painted piece of rubble. That's what's happening. It's nothing new. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 25, it says this, when the storm is over, there's nothing left of the wicked. Good people, firm on their rock foundation, aren't even fazed. You see, the thing that's happening here in the story is Jesus saying, everybody gets a choice to either listen to the words of Jesus and put them into practice so that it results in change, or to ignore them. What people do not get a choice in is that every single person's life, there are storms headed your way. And you don't get to choose those. You don't get to choose when they happen, how long they happen. That's out of your hands. Ultimately, in thinking through how do we make this as simple as possible, that's where our church name came from, was this passage. Thinking through it as I was kind of going through, like, man, what a name that has some significance. So I started looking through this first message from Jesus, and that's what stuck. If I could choose one thing to remind people every time they hear our name, what would it be? It'd be Matthew chapter 7. And so for this last 10 months, as we've added people to the team, they've all started to hear this phrase. And it's caveman-like, I'll be honest with you. It's simple. There's a term for the words in between words. I'm not sure what they are. My wife's an English teacher. I probably should have asked before I got up here. It says this: rock good, sand bad. Rock good, sand bad. That's as simple as we can make it, right? Rock good, sand bad. Rock good, sand bad. Say it with me. Rock good, sand bad. That's the truth. If you can remember the story in Matthew chapter 7, and you walk out of here and somebody says, well, hey, how's that silly church that started this past Sunday? Well, what'd you learn? How was it? Rock good, sand bad. I'll take it. I'll take it. You see, what we notice, this is even Three Little Pigs type differences where we go from straw to brick, stick in between. What we're seeing here in the story from Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, where he points out rock good, sand bad, is that there is no difference in the house. So two men, one's wise, one's foolish, they both build houses. Both of them are the same. When you look at him, you're like, man, that's a great house. That's super nice. It's got one of them bed swings on the porch. You know what I'm talking about? That's awesome. It's got a metal roof, right? It's got a little Georgia Bulldog sign sitting in the yard, a little flag waving. It's the perfect place. Hey, let me ask you this. You think if the guy that built his house on sand had went to Hobby Lobby and got a cross and put it on the house, it would have still stood? No. You think if he had put passage of scripture on his wall, as you walk through the house, maybe you saw it, Do you think that would have stopped the storm from knocking his house down and built on the sand? No. Doesn't matter what you build it with. Matters what you build it on. We can whitewash our lives. We can get the best paint and we can purdy it up. But at the end of the day, it's just a pretty pile of rubble. It's not built on something. It's not built on rock. Rock, good. Sand, bad. That's what we're looking at when we look at that passage. That's what we want to take away from. Ultimately, the things that we make with our hands, they will not survive. That's part of the reason Jesus is saying, look, here's the deal. Ultimately, even if you don't build your own house, you still pay somebody else. Someone's hands build it. And anything built with human hands is not going to withstand the test of time, right? But if you think about it, the foundation, that rock, that bedrock, that wasn't built with human hands, was it? That's why it's not going anywhere. It's not what you build with. It's what you build it on. So the question becomes, if we've got two options, put the words of Jesus into practice, results in action, or to be content, ignore them, stay the same. Ultimately, don't we wager a little bit in our own life? Well, you know what? How bad are these storms going to be? You know, I mean, how long would it take me to rebuild that house? You know, after it came, you know, would I get some insurance money from it? You know, we're asking some of them questions. Let's talk about it for a second. Let's look and ask the question, well, what are they? I mean, in Palestine, first century Palestine, this is when this was written, right? First century Palestine, the ground doesn't hold water, doesn't soak it up. So floods were fairly normal. It's a real issue. You know, a flash flood like that. For us, what are those things in our life that can just happen like that? Snap of a finger, right? The loss of somebody we love, loses their life. In an instant, done. Our health and our physical issues, we sit in a room and a doctor walks in, and in one phrase, our world changes. Financial crisis, where we wagered on our skills and ability and talent, only to find out that we don't win all the time. We have job loss. There's somebody younger than us that does it a little better and cheaper. They don't need the old guys anymore with experience. Maybe you're passed over for a promotion. Maybe it's because you're gender. Or maybe it's because you have integrity and they need somebody that'll bend a little bit at the top. Maybe you start seeing a little marriage failure where one small thing has led to another and names were called and you just can't forget some of the things he said or she said. I'd say those are storms that tear your house down. In a moment, it changes things. The question becomes, what'd you build it on? And we ask the question, what is the rock? It's the words of Jesus. It's the truth of Jesus. It's Jesus. That's what we're talking about when we ask, have you built your life? Have you built your life on a firm foundation? And I tell you, there's a warning that happens in this story, in this sermon, this message from Jesus. Because he says, hey, here's the deal. I'm going to give you some things in the first part of my talk that I want you to put into practice. But it is possible. It is possible to take those words of Jesus. It's possible to take them and work them into your life in a way that it looks like you're actually putting them into practice, but you're really not. And it's a warning, and one that I think we ought to take fairly serious. It's one that certainly makes my heart race a little bit, because I want to make sure on my end that I'm not falling into this warning that Jesus gives. This warning, honestly, if you're someone who's in church for the first time this warning's not you. You can help prepare for this. It can be your warning. If you've been out of church for a long time, 10, 15, 20 years, hadn't been in any kind of church, right? Then maybe this isn't right. It can help you prepare for what's coming if you want to stick this out with us. But honestly, this warning is for people who have been a follower of Jesus for a long time, who've been trying to work these things into your life. But you know as well as I do, it's just whitewash, it's just fancy paint. That it looks like it. It says this, Matthew 7, verse 21, it says this, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons? And in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Now I'm sitting there thinking, whoa, hold on 1 second. So they're prophesying in the name of Jesus. They're casting out demons in the name of Jesus. They acknowledge him as Lord, as King, right? So that word gives us that leads us to Lord. They're doing all those things, and Jesus looks at them and says, "I don't even know who you are." You notice that all of those things are things that everybody else watches you do. And so when the spotlight comes on, all of a sudden you get into character and you start making things happen. You're a mover and a shaker. But Jesus says, hey, let's be honest. When those crowds are around you, you didn't bring me with you. You just brought the fancy things. But then when you're alone at your house, you're just figuring out how to make a house bigger on the sand that you rented. You're a follower of Jesus. It's a real warning that every single one of us every day got to take stock in. We got to ask ourselves that question. It's never a question that you graduate from. It's a question you work into who you are in your life. A man named J.C. Ryle, he was the first Anglican bishop in Liverpool, England, a long time ago. He said this, I loved it. He says, "A religion which costs us nothing and consists in nothing but hearing sermons will always prove at last to be a useless thing." That's what Jesus is trying to say. If you just came to hear the message today, that ain't going to be no good when the storms come. You say, well, Clint, you done told us a lot about these choices we get to make, right? We either build our house on a foundation, we build on the sand. The way we figure that out is, do we put the words of Jesus into practice? But you hadn't told us the words of Jesus yet. Yeah, it's because it's like a big sermon, you know? Welcome to a 3-week series. I wanted to start at the end so that we understood the stakes, that we established that yes, Jesus is going to give us some specifics, but ultimately for us to understand the specifics, we've got to recognize Jesus as having value to give us specifics. The specifics, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. The next 2 weeks is just a 3-week deal, right? We're going to look at the two probably most difficult things that Jesus tells us to do. What do we do about worry, and how do we deal with anger? Two things that are incredibly difficult. But you know as well as I do that it might be you Oftentimes in my life, it's been me. You find somebody who talks fast and has a tongue that cuts like a sword to people. And suddenly my house is falling down because of words that come out of my mouth. But Jesus, he gives us some specifics on how to handle those things. Even when you're justified in your anger. He talks specifically how for us, we ought to interact with our enemies. And we'll talk about those things week 2, week 3 of the series. But today we wanted to make sure that we understood Jesus. That he's given us a choice. And in order for us to go into week 2 and week 3, for us to dive into the other parts of this message, we had to first set a foundation. We first had to say, hey, let me give you a heads up on a couple things that are headed your way. Because if you come for week 2 and week 3 and you make the changes in your life, I can already tell you this will happen to you. If you're somebody who flies off at the mouth oftentimes and your anger's out of control and people know you and maybe they just call you type A, right? Oh, he's type A, right? Or he's a perfectionist, you know? If that's you and you start making changes, you know what's going to happen? People at your work are like, what happened to you? Did you bring your pansy pants this morning? People start noticing the change and they'll ask you why. Maybe you'll say Jesus and they're like, oh goodness. He goes to one church service and changes his life. I tell you what, misery loves company, doesn't it? It does. People won't believe you, and so you've got to prepare this week. You got to spend some time in prayer asking, okay, Jesus, I get you're going to challenge me with some words. You're going to challenge me with what to build my life on. And it's going to be difficult. And so I want to spend a week preparing before we walk into these next 2 weeks together. You might be saying, well, hold on, I've invested a lot in my house, and I promise you it's built on sand. What do I do? Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a number of guys in here that work in the dirt for a living, and they'll tell you it's a hard process. And there's no easy way around it. You know, in a bird cage, I don't know if we had a bird. There were birds around me when I was growing up. I think my grandmother had a couple birds. One we thought was a guy, ended up being a girl, started laying eggs. It was weird. Name was Pete. When a bird poops in the cage, right, you can just go to the very bottom and pull it out and get rid of all the crap that's in there, right? That ain't the way with the foundation of a house. You don't get to just go to the bottom and rip it out, take all the junk and crap and put it back in there. You don't get to do that. You got to tear down what's on top. And then if you want to stay in that exact location, that's okay, but you're going to have to dig down past the sand and find the rock, or you're going to have to move. You have to move your life to a place where there's rock. And then you can start. The incredible thing about what we believe at Foundation is that you belong here, which means that we want to partner with you in that deconstruction and that laying of the foundation and starting to build your life. We want to help. You're just thinking, well, Clint, my house is built on a rock. No doubt. That I put the work in. That I'm ready. Like, bring it on, baby. It's solid. I say, go get a shovel. Find somebody who didn't and get to work. Jump into somebody else's life. Someone else's life that's real messy. Where you're going to get real dirty. Let's see what we can build together. I'll close with this. It's another quote from J.C. Ryle. It says this, in the time of trial, his religion does not fail him.
The floods of sickness, sorrow, poverty, disappointments, bereavements beat upon him in vain. His soul stands unmoved. His faith does not give way. His comforts do not utterly forsake him. His religion may have cost him trouble in the past. His foundation may have been obtained with much labor and many tears. To discover his own interest in Christ may have required many a day of earnest seeking and many an hour of wrestling in prayer. But his labor has not been thrown away. He now reaps a rich reward. The religion that can stand trial is the true religion. That's what Jesus offers. Jesus offers you an opportunity to build a life on something that can stand and withstand the trials, the storms of life, the tsunami, the hurricane, the earthquake, the hail, tornado. It can do it. It'll survive.